Today's podcast of Hellbent for Horror is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/Hellbent for Horror. Audible has over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Hi, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror. I'm S.A. Bradley, and I'm a lifelong movie lover, but my heart belongs to horror. My biggest thrill, however, is getting to talk to people about this stuff. I really want to start conversations with you. Now, I love all types of films, not just horror movies, and I'm pretty knowledgeable. So when I go to parties, I tend to find my fellow cinema lovers and we dig in. If the conversation's going really well, sooner or later, I drop what I call the H-bomb. I bring up a horror movie. It usually catches the other person by surprise, because I go into the same kind of detail in breaking down a horror film that I would use, say, on a Stanley Kubrick film. There's usually one of two responses. In the first, I get a dismissive look and they tell me I don't watch horror films. That's fine. We go back to debating whether Buster Keaton was better than Charlie Chaplin. The second response is a little bit more problematic. I get a look of shock, but they let me complete my thought. Then they say, "Oh, I just can't stand how violent horror movies are, especially when it's violence against women. You don't like those kind, do you?" And I hesitate. My mind races. Just what one type is this person really talking about? Of course, it's a leading question. It's phrased in a way that already puts you in a position of guilt dependent upon your answer. With that said, it's still a very valid question. I answer it as honestly as I can. I say, well, not all of them. There are movies that go outside of my limits. My answer is usually met with a lukewarm smirk. I don't apologize for being a horror fan, even for the very violent movies that I like, even the ones that have little to no socially redeeming value. At the same time, loving gory, violent horror movies is not a political movement. I'm not a lobbyist for big horror. You don't need to agree with me. And yet, I want to talk about this because I am conflicted about some of the movies I watch. It interests me that I can still get contradictory feelings from a movie. Some of these movies are indefensible to anyone who doesn't watch horror. Some are indefensible to those who do watch horror. I'm fascinated by the forbidden. Yet, there are brutal films I won't go near and I'll never see. What are my limits? It's the elephant in the room, because we all know that as horror fans, we voluntarily swim in dark waters. And this is about the darkest waters. Exploitation and extreme horror cinema. It's been given many names: splatter, mondo, grindhouse, hardcore horror, video nasties, gonzo, torture porn, thrill kill, splattercore, death film, Asian and French extreme, Hong Kong Cat 3 films, depraved, disturbing, snuff. So do I have limits? Of course I do. But it depends. It's complicated. And here's what I mean. I can tell you that there are subjects that I have no interest in. Violence against children, pedophilia, necrophilia. And yet, the amazing and underrated movie Frailty uses mental and physical abuse of a child to drive home a parable. And that parable is about the dangers of religious fervor. And then there's L.I.E, which stands for Long Island Expressway, or the lie that feeds the projected fears of a neighborhood when a sexual predator moves next door to a boy. Then there's the horror satire Dead Girl, which uses the premise of horny teenage boys finding an undead girl chained to a table to really mock the moral emptiness of male privilege. Of course, these movies aren't about their subjects any more than the musical Sweeney Todd is about cannibalism. If a movie is just about making me sick to my stomach, life's too damn short. And to be honest, a lot of extreme cinema is just that. But there are those films that transcend the subject matter and the gore to truly make my jaw drop. They are profane but passionate. They haunt me long after they're over. And I can tell you, I don't need to go to extreme horror films to have my limits tested. Mainstream films can be soulless and cynical money grabs, and that's a limit I have. Case in point, I'm not a big fan of the slasher films of the 1980s. I started out as a fan. The original Friday the 13th was insane and unpredictable. It didn't just throw away the rule book, it burned the rule book. Very punk, very metal. But very quickly, slasher movies went from being unpredictable and exciting to very predictable, very boring. And sometimes movies that are considered horror masterpieces test my limits as well. I have a real love-hate relationship with late Wes Craven's Last House on the Left. You have to sit through some really inept shit to get to see why that's revered. I hate the sophomoric attempts at comedy relief. The buffoonery of the police, it's literally taken to slapstick levels. And there's banjo music. This is a movie that contains a devastating murder-rape sequence. It's a historic one. And yet, I champion Last House because it contains one of the most devastating and sublime moments in horror movie history. It's not the murder of one girl and the rape of another. It's the moment right after it. There's no dialogue. Honestly, what could be said? The killers stand around as if they just came out of a trance and they realize what they've done. Reality's sunk in. They don't look at each other. They can't. There's blood in one killer's eye. Another rubs her bloody palms on her blood-soaked jeans, while another killer tries to pick blades of grass out of the sticky blood that's on his hands. This is shame. This is guilt. You feel grief, not bloodlust. It's truly horrible beautiful. Last House on the Left is one of the pillars of modern horror, but it started as an exploitation film called Sex Crime of the Century. And the evolutionary grandfather to extreme cinema is the exploitation film. When I talk about the history of exploitation films, I'm reminded of an old Far Side comic by Gary Larson. In that comic, there's two scientists in a lab. One's doing some chemistry. The other sits right next to him and is aiming a rubber band at the other scientist's head. The caption says, "On October 23rd, 1927, 3 days after its invention, the first rubber band is tested." The creation of the motion picture and the birth of exploitation cinema is a lot like that. The first movie studio was Thomas Edison's Black Maria. Now, Edison was an inventor, so his first movies were for science. They're experiments. The first movie Edison made was Fred Ott's Sneeze. Yes, the first film is of a guy sneezing. So much for high art. Then Edison made The Kiss. It's the first kiss in cinema history, and it actually caused a scandal because American society still followed Victorian morals. Of course, people flocked to see it. Edison noticed. So he made Charmian's Trapeze Striptease. It's exactly what it sounds like. Acrobatics and nudity together at last. Then in the same year, things got a little darker. This was a turning point. Edison's company made The Execution of Zolgaz. It's a meticulous reenactment of the actual death by electric chair of a guy who assassinated William McKinley. Not only did the filmmakers stage an exact reenactment, but they also went to the actual Auburn prison and shot an exterior panorama. That sets the location in the minds of the audience. It's a real place. Is this real too? Now, it's the same trick Faces of Death would use with their fake reality footage 80 years later. In 1901, it was easy to believe that the electrocution was really happening. Some movie distributors claimed it was the real thing. That claim increased ticket sales. Of course, it was not the real thing. However, just 2 years later, audiences did get the real thing. Edison's company made the movie Electrocuting an Elephant in 1903. It shows the actual electrocution of Topsy the elephant. It was real, and it was horrible. I watched it. Edison saw that people had a fascination with death. He realized that the movie camera created distance from the real thing. So people would pay to take a look at something they wouldn't want to experience. Edison went on to make several more recreations of historic executions and assassinations. He didn't lose money doing it. There has always been an audience for the disturbing and the unsettling. Exploitation films have always been fueled by both curiosity and outrage. They exploit what we secretly either fear or we secretly desire. The silent film era was notorious for movies that had excessive violence, excessive sex, and nudity. D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation is infamous for its racism, but it also came under fire for scenes of rape and a nasty castration. There was even more sex and violence in Griffith's Intolerance, which used the fall of Babylon as a setting for beheadings, disembowelings, and rape. However, by the 1920s, the public was souring on the permissiveness that was being seen in the movies. After a few high-profile Hollywood scandals, the Motion Picture Production Code came into being. Its purpose was to clean up the morals of Hollywood. While it did clean up Hollywood, the studios made more wholesome fare. However, each studio also owned chains of movie theaters across the country that would only show their code-approved movies. a monopoly was created. Moral outrage pushed the more low-budget, violent, and obscene movies into the shadows, underground. And that's when things get really crazy. Of course, the demand for these types of movies never went away, so the producers and the distributors found independent theaters that would show them. Sometimes they set up tents outside of town and shamelessly promoted the films like they were contraband, and, in true carny tradition, they'd make a hasty getaway when the police came to run them off. Since these 40 thieves worked outside of the system, they also worked outside of the laws. So the kid gloves came off. The movies became adults only. More sex, more violence. Movies like Dwayne Esper's Maniac had plenty of women getting stripped nude, violent fights, and even a cat getting its eye gouged out. Yeah, code this. This gave an aura of danger that made the movies even more forbidden. Unintentionally, the production code created a secondary market. Exploitation cinema. Since exploitation films are fueled by curiosity and outrage, the directors and producers needed to know what freaked people out and what turned people on, and then make a quick buck about it before the mood changed. You could definitely tell what housewives were hysterical about each year by what was in the grindhouse. One week it's drug mania, the next it's teen pregnancy, then it's crime waves, then it's juvenile delinquency, then it's nudie cuties and sex change documentaries. But then, the movies get darker when the roughies appear in the 1950s and the 1960s. These were low-budget movies that added rough violence to the sex. The roughies were about taking things with force. Roughies had titles like Violated and Scum of the Earth. Women get their clothes physically ripped off their backs. They're slapped hard enough for men to draw blood. Women are punched with balled fists. They're whipped and then beaten with boards that have nails in them. It's all about submission, domination. I think there's two reasons that the violence gets ugly about now. The first is that Psycho, the first modern horror film, was a runaway success. Psycho raised the intensity of on-screen violence, if not actual on-screen violence, that a mainstream film could get away with. If that was okay in a mainstream movie, exploitation was going to have to up the ante. The second reason is that the culture itself had become increasingly unpredictable and more violent. Church bombings, assassinations. There was anxiety over not feeling safe. In the midst of this, two directors of roughies went on to help lay the groundwork for what would become extreme cinema. One was Michael Finley, and the other was Herschel Gordon Lewis. Herschel Gordon Lewis single-handedly created gore and splatter films. Splatter films would be in living color, and these movies would go all the way with the violence. All the way. The first splatter film is 1963's Blood Feast. It's the story of a food caterer who dismembers women to put in a stew that's going to be used in a ritual sacrifice for an Egyptian goddess. I have to admit, I have a hard time with Blood Feast. It's really primitive, and the acting is horrible. But the gore effects were obviously influential. Arms are hacked off, eyes are stabbed out, the top of a head is cut off, and the brain's removed. And then there's the crowning achievement. A woman's tongue is pulled out of her head on camera. I can't even imagine what the impact must have been to see that back in 1963. Blood Feast created a visual and visceral style that opened the floodgates to a much more graphic cinema. Blood Feast gives us gore as the method of transmission for extreme cinema. However, there was another influence that was going to help create a style blueprint: real life. In the 1960s, there started a subgenre of documentaries called Mondo. The first was 1962's Mondo Cane, which means a dog's world in Italian. Mondo Cane was pure sensationalism pretending to be educational. These Mondo films showed bizarre rituals and grotesqueries around the world. Most of them were horrible things happening to animals. But there were also scenes of religious fanatics who wore real crowns of thorns and lacerated themselves in the thighs with rocks to feel the Savior's pain. Their blood smears out into the street. Even though there was more violence being shown in fictional films, the forbidden possibility of seeing something real made Mondo Cane an underground hit. Of course, it wasn't all real. Just like Edison before them and the producers of Faces of Death would do in the 80s, stage events were pawned off as real. Mondo Cane staged scenes. Now this cost money. Why go through the trouble of pretending? Because the audiences wanted to believe it was real. They wanted reality. Or so they thought they did. On August 8th and 9th in 1969, reality got a lot scarier. 5 people were savagely murdered at the Hollywood home of Roman Polanski and included his pregnant wife Sharon Tate. The next night, Lino and Rosemary LaBianca were brutally murdered in their home. The killing seemed ritualistic. Words were written in blood at both homes. Nobody knew who did it. Terror gripped the nation. And that terror didn't end when we found out who it was. These were kids. The average age of the Manson family at the time of the murders was 21. I don't want to go into a lot of detail here. First off, I don't like to give Manson undue publicity. I also feel most people know enough about it. However, it is impossible to talk about extreme cinema without bringing up the Manson family. This one event changed popular culture, investigative reporting, and journalism forever. And it might not have been so, if not for the news footage of the family going into custody. Had the Manson family members covered their heads with jackets or looked away like other killers before them, they might have been just an obscure historical footnote. But they stared right into the camera, defiant, unrepentant, unafraid. This story was not over. Real life had just gotten extreme, and there was outrage and curiosity. It became the crime of the century. The murders and the victims and the motives, they got discussed in great detail over and over again. And when the facts were exhausted, that's when speculation started. And it is here that the world is introduced to the word snuff. The term didn't come from a filmmaker. It didn't come from the lips of Manson or his followers. It didn't get spoken by FBI agents or police. It came from a guy writing a book. In Ed Sanders' book, The Family, he speculates that family members stole 8mm cameras from a news van, and then they may have used them to film human sacrifices at night, movies that show real death and that were sold as entertainment for a secret clientele. Sanders called them snuff films. Of course, it's all bullshit. No snuff films were ever found by the FBI. But none of that matters. Snuff films became urban legend. The fear that life could be so cheap, that entered the popular culture. Now, I was too young to understand what the trial of the century meant to America, but I was very aware of the legend of snuff films at an early age. True story. Friends of a friend told my uncle about being at a bachelor party, and they had seen a stag film that ended with the hooker getting shot in the head. While you're trying to wrap your head around what kind of bachelor party would show this, let me say that the people telling the story weren't kids who loved horror movies. These were adults whose only other urban legend was about gypsies rolling into town to steal your silverware. So the FBI can't find any proof that snuff films exist, but the hysteria lives on. What's next? If you're director Michael Finley, you make one. Kind of. Not a real snuff movie. Not even a real movie. Michael Finley is in film history books for 3 minutes of footage that he didn't direct, that was tacked onto a terrible film that he did direct. Finley made a movie called Slaughter in Argentina back in 1971. It was a failed attempt to cash in on a Manson family-style cult. It gathered dust until 1975. Then, distributor Alan Shackleton read a news article about rumored snuff films being smuggled in from South America, and he got an idea. He got a small crew to shoot a cinema verite scene that would look like a real murder. He spliced that scene to the end of Slaughter. He hoped it would feel like it was put in there to help smuggle the clip into the U.S. Shackleton released Snuff with no credits on the film. The poster said, "The film that could only be made in South America where life is cheap." Shackleton paid people to protest the movie just to drum up attention. He didn't need to. It didn't take long for them to be joined by real protesters from Women Against Pornography. The urban legend and hysteria did the rest. Snuff made millions. It didn't matter that it was already proven to be a hoax, because it had an aura of danger. Just saying the name felt heavy. I understand, because I felt that about Snuff too. I found the movie for rent in a video store almost a decade later. I couldn't believe it. Did they know what they had here? The box felt heavy in my hand. I felt anxious as I put it in the VCR. Sometimes the only way to break a spell is to watch. It didn't take too long for the spell to be broken. What followed was gruesome but amateurish. It was dismemberment. Real life doesn't have cutaways or reaction shots. How did so many people fall for this? The same can be asked about snuff's modern counterpart, the infamous guinea pig films from Japan. These movies became legendary because Charlie Sheen thought they were real snuff and called the FBI. How a guy who made movies for a living was fooled is anybody's guess. I watched Guinea Pig 2, Flowers of Flesh and Blood. It's the story of a killer, dressed as a samurai, slowly dismembering a drug girl on a bed. End of story. There are 7 guinea pig films. One was enough for me. It left me feeling nothing. It's an odd thing. I can be a real gorehound and relish the effects in movies like Reanimator and Videodrome, and I'm horrified if I see a news clip that has actual carnage. But these films that try to ape the real thing leave me cold. They're antiseptic, emotionless. They are experiments. However, extreme cinema covers more than just snuff types of films. Some of them brim with emotion and are extreme because they refuse to have any kind of filters on them. Those are the ones that stick with me. When extreme films work, you feel tested, but also invested in what's going on in the screen. It's exciting when a movie proves to me I can still be vulnerable. Some are gory. For others, it's the ideas in the film that are extreme. Some have both. Of course, what is extreme and disturbing? It's subjective. Still, here are some I recommend. 2008's Martyrs. This movie divides hardcore fans. I think it's a legitimate masterpiece. The less I say about it, the better. Take the dare. Thank me or hate me later. Inside. It's the best French extreme film outside of Martyrs. It's insanely gory, but never at the detriment of character development or suspense. It's a rarity. Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. It's rough going, but it's influential. To this day, I can't play this movie if my wife's in the house. Even if she's asleep, she'll moan in a nightmare if she hears the soundtrack. I guess that's some kind of endorsement. Cannibal Holocaust. Talk about rough going. It's the granddaddy of all Italian cannibal films, and it's one of the most disturbing films I've ever seen. There's a lot to hate in it, including the pointless killing of animals. Even with that, I still can't deny its dark power. Audition. All I can say is watch this one closely. This is a movie that starts as one genre and ends in hell. Wow. Pink Flamingos. Depending on how twisted your humor is, this is either a comedy masterwork or a true horror show. Fun tidbit about me. During the 1980s, when I was a firefighter in the Air Force, I was asked to get the nastiest movie I could for movie night. I got Pink Flamingos and a reputation. Last House on Dead End Street. This is the epitome of 70s exploitation as extreme horror. It is one of the most nihilistic films I've ever watched. It's surreal, it's unhinged, and the last 20 minutes will make your jaw drop. When you can say that the surgery scene in a film isn't the most disturbing moment, you're in rare waters. 4 words. Deer hoof fellatio scene. My Sweet Satan. In the 19 minutes running time, Jim Van Bebber captured more authenticity about the directionless kids that exist in every generation than in all of River's Edge and Suburbia combined. The gory finale is shocking, but to me, the real shocks lie in the kids' conversations. As a teenager, I had my years where I was in danger going off the radar. I was in these conversations. I could have ended up lost. To me, this movie feels almost too real. If you're an extreme horror fan, my list may not include an infamous film or two that you'd expect to see. Well, either I didn't like it or I won't watch it. It's beyond my limits. However, when I was at a recent horror convention, I came face to face with one of the movies that I had avoided for 15 years, and the director. The movie was August Underground. The director and star of the film was Fred Vogel. I knew a lot about the movie. If you look up any list of the most disturbing films, chances are August Underground is there. I didn't feel I needed to see this. However, I talked to a few people and heard that Fred was a really nice guy. I was compelled to go over and just talk to him. I was really frank with him. I let him know that I avoided his film. I told him I wasn't quite sure why. To his credit, Fred listened carefully and he wasn't defensive. I sensed he had empathy around this. He may have heard this before. We were talking like film lovers, not gorehounds. So I made a choice. I told him that I was going to buy the film, go up to my room and watch it, come back and let him know my honest opinion, if he wanted it. He pointed me to the cheapest version of the film, and he said he'd welcome my opinion. I went to the hotel room and slid the DVD into my laptop. I felt very anxious. The feeling of watching extreme cinema is the feeling of the forbidden. It's the feeling you get when you step into a bar and you're underage, when you walk past a security guard and you don't have a badge, when you go to the adult section at a bookstore. You are willfully ending your innocence. A quick overview on August Underground. Fred Vogel wanted this film to feel like you had found an unmarked videotape in an alley and you put it into your VCR. To your horror, you find out that you are unwittingly watching a video journal of a serial killer and his sadistic friend. The video is badly degraded. You might be the last person to watch this before the memory of the atrocities slip away forever. You are trapped with a terrible secret. I watched it. I had the wind knocked out of me. This felt very real. I'm not talking about the set pieces with makeup effects, although the effects are very good. It was that I knew these guys. I knew this casual sadism that's hidden inside their jokes. I knew their indifference to getting into trouble. I knew they were fun when they got bored, or they were dangerous. They didn't look like dirtbags. They looked like farm boys. I had these friends in high school. They didn't look like my metalhead friends. They wore their outrage externally. These guys, they blended in. They were my crazy friends. I mean, you could count on them to liven up a boring night. However, they took a weird liking to a mentally challenged man. They would invite him to parties in the woods and behind the school. They'd feed him beers and pal up to him, then later get him to dance for them. This guy loved to dance. It might have started as fun, but the mood would change. They'd throw rocks at his feet, and if someone would protest, these guys would diffuse it with a joke, and they'd say, "It's all okay, don't worry." It wasn't okay. I stopped hanging out with them when they started inviting him to more and more parties. It was uncomfortable. But I didn't report them. Surely they're just being assholes, right? What none of us knew was that these two guys were luring this man back to one of their garages. When there, they physically and mentally abused him. They got caught because one night they decided to shave his head and spray paint it silver. They cut his scalp up. It got infected by the paint. He went to the hospital, nearly blind from fever. Everything came out in the emergency room. It made the news. They went to juvenile prison. My first thought was, why didn't I see this evil in them? My second thought was, what was it that kept me from being like them? Why didn't I stick around? There's a scene in August Underground that I lived through. It takes place in a convenience store. In the movie, the killers make a scene and they get thrown out by the manager. They laugh at him all the way. Then they come back to the store to make up and apologize. Then they taunt him all over again. I was involved in this kind of scene. We left the manager feeling helpless. He stood up to us. Why wouldn't we just go away? We finally do leave, on our own terms, just like in the movie. However, in the movie, they come back one more time and they kill him. I go downstairs to find Fred. I don't tell him any of this. I shake his hand and tell him that for the type of film that this is, it's very effective and it's very realistic. I thank him for his work. He thanks me for giving it a chance. What are my limits? All I can say is I'm lucky to have them in real life. I've seen those who do not. I'll push my limits in the bloody fantasy of horror films, and only there, thank you. Because real life is too extreme for me. Thanks for listening. I'd love to hear your opinions and your own extreme cinema lists. If you're interested in learning more about what I've talked about today, I'd like to direct you to a good book that covers a lot of the subjects I just spoke about. It's called The Horror of It All, One Moviegoer's Love Affair with Masked Maniacs, Frightened Virgins, and the Living Dead by Adam Rockoff. I know it's a good book because I strongly disagree with Rockoff almost as often as I strongly agree with him. To me, that makes it fair and balanced. Adam's book is available on Amazon, and it's also available as an audiobook on audible.com. For you, the listeners of Hellbent for Horror, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/hellbentforhorror. Now that's audibletrial.com/hellbentforhorror, and you can listen to Adam's book today. Thanks for listening, folks. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can subscribe to Hellbent for Horror on iTunes and Stitcher, and if you like the show, please consider writing a review on iTunes or Stitcher. It really helps. You can find more on our Facebook page at facebook.com/Hellbent for Horror, and I'm on Twitter at Hellbent Horror. You can also find more info on my website, hellbentforhorror.com. Till next time, stay hellbent.